that nobody could have seen this coming nonsense. Can you believe that title?
Gets you fired up right away.
Talk about a bold statement.
Definitely grabs your attention.
That's the blog post we're diving into today.
Mm-hmm.
It's by Tony Parkin, an educational technologist. And he wrote it back in April 2020, right when things were,
Right in the thick of it.
Exactly. So what's got Parkin so fired up? Well, he's pushing back against this idea that the sudden shift to online learning,
Like it was a complete surprise.
yeah, like it came out of nowhere.
Right.
But his argument is that there were signs, even preparations,
Going way
as
back.
far back as the early 2000s.
Interesting.
So it wasn't this unforeseen crisis, at least not entirely.
And what makes Parkin's perspective so interesting is that it's not just, some vague feeling. He's talking about actual government initiatives, technological developments,
Right.
real concrete things.
He talks about this early 2000s wave of enthusiasm for Web 2.0 in education, remember blogs and wikis,
Oh, yeah.
early social media, all that.
Trying to figure out what to do with it.
And he makes the point that it wasn't just a passing fad for educators.
Some people might have thought so at the time.
Yeah, but teachers were really starting to see how these tools could, really change how students learn.
It wasn't about replacing traditional teaching, though. It was about giving teachers new approaches.
Empowering them.
Exactly. And there were some really interesting experiments happening.
Like that story of Carol Webb, the teacher who basically stumbled onto this proto-flipped classroom model.
I love that story.
Completely by accident. Just makes you wonder how many other innovations were, bubbling under the surface.
Oh, I'm sure there were tons.
At the time,
Yeah.
just waiting for someone to, to notice.
So what happened with Carol? Remind me.
So she started uploading her lesson plans online over the weekend just to, stay organized.
Makes sense.
But then students started accessing them before class.
Whoa.
So they were basically teaching themselves the material ahead of time.
Wow. Talk about being ahead of the curve.
Right. I can imagine some teachers being horrified, like, hey, all my best material gone before I even step in the classroom.
I can see that.
But Carol, she embraced it. She saw how this could lead to, much richer discussions in class,
That's great.
deeper learning because they'd already done, kind of the first pass at the material.
It's about adapting, isn't it?
Exactly. Being willing to experiment and adapt.
That's what made her such a pioneer.
It's a good reminder that even these accidental discoveries can have a huge ripple effect.
Absolutely.
But Parkin's argument, it goes beyond just individual teachers tinkering with new tools.
Okay.
He says that the UK government was well aware of the potential need for remote learning in a crisis.
Really?
Yeah. He points out that they were actively studying pandemic threats, running scenarios, and they were even looking for ways to keep education going during potential long-term school closures.
Interesting.
This wasn't just, some fringe concern.
Though we're taking it seriously.
They were taking it seriously. They knew this was a real possibility.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah.
And it wasn't all just theoretical either, right?
Exactly. And this is where Parkin brings in some really compelling real-world examples.
Like what?
Like the case of Campsmount Technology College.
Campsmount.
This school had to go fully virtual back in 2009 after a fire destroyed their building.
Oh, wow.
Talk about a real-world test case.
Thrown into the deep end.
Right.
What did they do?
Well, they used everything they could get their hands on. Facebook, YouTube, you name it.
To actually deliver lessons.
To deliver lessons, to communicate with parents,
Wow.
just to try and maintain some sense of normalcy for the students,
Makes you wonder what they learned from that experience.
I know, right?
Because clearly schools can adapt to these kinds of disruptions.
Right.
But the question is, did we take those lessons to heart?
That's the million-dollar question. And I think Parkin would say, probably not as much as we should have.
Interesting.
It's easy to just focus on the challenges, the fires, and the scrambling to adapt.
Right.
But what's really interesting is that alongside those real-world tests, there were actual initiatives happening to try and prepare for a potential shift online.
Like what kind of initiatives?
Well, one example Parkin talks about is the Home Access Program.
Okay, rings a bell.
It was aimed at providing disadvantaged students with computers and internet access.
Right, which would have been crucial in a situation where everyone needs to learn remotely.
Exactly. And then there was the Building Schools for the Future program.
That one always makes me think of, shiny new buildings.
I know, right? New classrooms, fancy architecture. But Parkin points out that it was about much more than just bricks and mortar.
It was about more than just buildings.
Yeah, it was actually designed as a change management program,
Interesting.
encouraging schools to think long-term about technology.
Yeah.
How to integrate it effectively, how to create these more resilient and flexible learning environments.
So it was about future-proofing education in a way,
Exactly. It's almost like they could see these potential disruptions on the horizon.
and trying to lay the groundwork.
Yeah, to create a more adaptable system.
Wow, that's fascinating.
But this is where Parkin's critique really comes into focus.
What do you mean?
He argues that these programs, while they weren't perfect, of course,
Yeah.
they had real potential. But they were ultimately cut short.
They were.
Yeah, or just sort of neglected. It's like we took our eye off the ball.
We dropped the ball.
And it makes you wonder, if those programs had been given the resources, the support, the long-term commitment they needed,
Yeah.
would we have been better prepared when things finally hit the fan?
It's hard to say for sure,
Of course.
but it's definitely a thought-provoking question.
It is, and it makes you think about all those voices at the time, those who were skeptical of EdTech.
Right, the naysayers.
Because it's easy to look back now and be like, well, of course technology is essential in education.
Right.
But back then, there were legitimate concerns, right?
Absolutely. Like, what about the social aspect of learning?
Exactly. Kids staring at screens all day, losing that personal connection with their teachers.
Those are still valid concerns.
They are. But Parkin's point is that the goal was never to replace teachers with technology. It was about giving teachers more tools, more options
I see.
to enhance their teaching, reach students in new ways.
It's about finding the right balance.
Exactly. Utilizing technology effectively without losing sight of that human element that makes education so powerful.
Makes sense.
And that's really the heart of Parkin's argument, I think.
What do you mean?
He's not just reminiscing about the good old days of EdTech,
Okay.
He's challenging us to think about our priorities.
How so?
How well do we actually learn from the past? Are we doomed to repeat these mistakes?
Good question.
Because he's essentially saying, look, we had a glimpse of what was possible. We even started to build towards it.
Yeah.
And then we let it fall by the wayside.
It's a sobering thought.
It really is.
Yeah.
So for our listener who's hopefully just as engrossed in this deep dive as we are,
I know I am.
what's the key takeaway here?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, Parkin doesn't offer any easy answers.
Right.
But he highlights a pattern in how we as a society often react to crises.
Instead of preparing for them.
Exactly. We scramble, we adapt, but then we forget.
And we don't always implement those hard-won lessons.
Right. And he's challenging us to do better, especially when it comes to something as crucial as education.
Because we tend to think in terms of immediate problems and solutions.
Put out the fire.
Exactly. But what Parkin's argument suggests is that we need to develop a longer-term perspective.
Play the long game.
And that means not just investing in new technologies, but also in the training, the support, the infrastructure needed to use them effectively.
It's about building a system that's ready for anything.
Exactly. Fostering that culture of innovation and adaptability.
Right, because the future of education isn't about just replicating the past in a digital format.
Right.
It's about finding new and better ways to help students thrive in an ever-changing world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We've sure covered a lot of ground today, haven't we?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
From that early wave of Web 2.0 in education
Those were the days.
to those government programs that, in hindsight, seem almost prescient.
Like they had a crystal ball or something.
All right. It really makes you think about how we perceive those early efforts.
And how much potential they really had.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because at the time, it was easy to dismiss them as, just dabbling with the latest tech gadgets.
Oh, yeah, just a fad.
But when you look at the bigger picture, the fact that the government was actively researching pandemic preparedness, running those scenarios, trying to figure out how to keep education going during a potential crisis.
It adds a whole new layer to the story, doesn't it?
It does. And it makes that blog post title we started with.
Nobody could have seen this coming nonsense.
Exactly. It makes that title land even harder,
Because clearly someone saw it coming.
Someone, or maybe even a lot of someones, saw the possibility.
And they were trying to sound the alarm or at least start the conversation.
Right. And that's what I find so compelling about Parkin's argument.
It's not about pointing fingers or saying, I told you so.
It's about learning from the past.
Exactly. Taking those lessons and using them to create a better future.
And he doesn't let us off the hook at the end either, does he? Well, he mentions this thing called exercise sickness.
Oh, yeah, that rings a
It
bell.
was this big pandemic preparedness exercise in the UK back in 2016.
I vaguely remember hearing about that.
It feels like there's a whole other deep dive just waiting to happen there.
Absolutely. What exactly was exercise sickness? And what came of it? Did they learn anything? Did they make changes?
Those are the million-dollar questions.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, it seems like getting those answers might be tricky.
How come?
Well, from what I've read, the full report on exercise sickness was never officially released.
Rick, seriously.
Seriously. Which, has led to all sorts of speculation and, let's be honest, conspiracy theories.
People love a good conspiracy theory, but that lack of transparency is concerning.
Right.
If we're not even willing to be open about what we learn from these exercises, what's the point of even doing them?
Exactly. It undermines the whole purpose.
And it kind of proves Parkin's point, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, it highlights that tendency we have to shy away from uncomfortable truths.
Instead of facing them head on and actually doing something about them.
Exactly. And that brings us right back to those early initiatives that we were talking about.
The Home Access Program, building schools for the future.
What if those programs had been given more time, more resources?
It really makes you wonder, would we have been better prepared when that unforeseen crisis finally hit?
Tough to say for sure, but it's certainly a question worth pondering.
It is. And it speaks to the importance of thinking long-term, of not letting those important conversations fade away just because the immediate crisis has passed.
Because the next one is always just around the corner, isn't it?
Unfortunately, that seems to be the case. But hey, on that cheery note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
I've learned a lot today. Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure. And to our listener, we'll leave you with this. Don't let the conversation end here. Go down that exercise sickness rabbit hole. See what you can big up. What do they learn? How do they act on those lessons or not?
And what can we learn from their experience as we navigate the ever-evolving landscape of education?
Because as we've seen today, sometimes the most valuable insights come from looking back in order to move forward. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep learning.